Hello and welcome everybody. I want to welcome you to our first ever webinar for supporters about the young raptor season here at the Raptor Center. My name is Steve. I am an admin assistant here at the Raptor Center, helping with the logistics of today's webinar. So if you look down at your control bar at the bottom of your webinar, you'll see a couple options, one of which is Q&A. So if you have questions while we're going along today, type your question in the question and answer box, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. We have disabled the chat just so that any questions are only in one area. We're not bouncing back and forth between the chat and the Q&A. So please just use the Q&A today. We also have people muted just to cut back on the background noise. But during that Q&A, if you do want to unmute yourself, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you as well. And just so everyone knows, we are recording this. So this will be recorded and then sent out to you and everyone who signed up later this afternoon. So I will not take up any more of our time. I'll kick it off to Lori Arent, who is the Assistant Director here at the Raptor Center, who will be our main presenter for the day.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I just wanted to take this opportunity before we started to let you know how excited we are that you are participating in this first ever webinar that we're doing for our donors. And I personally am very excited to give you guys a glimpse into what baby season is really like at the Raptor Center. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so I thought a really good place to start would be just to talk a little bit about what our philosophy is at the Raptor Center. So we really believe that in order for young raptors to have the best chance at survival, we need to keep them wild. So we focus a lot of our energy and resources on reuniting youngsters with their families, not raising them in captivity. We certainly, have the ability and the knowledge to raise them physically and make sure that they're healthy. But the thing that we really can't do very well is teach them all the things that they need to know in order to thrive. And what different species need as far as information really varies significantly. The other thing is that we do not incubate eggs. Some rehabilitation facilities do, but just knowing all the different factors that go into, as I mentioned, not only just raising a bird to be healthy physically, but mentally as well, is very challenging. And so we just don't feel like we can do an adequate job of that and give these birds a good chance at surviving. So then the question becomes, why do young raptors even need help in the first place? Well, most often it's because they're out of the nest for some reason, right? And there's several reasons why that could be. Probably the most prominent one is inclement weather. Raptors nest during springtime, and at least in Minnesota, we have these kind of really nasty spring storms sometimes with really high winds. And of course, if these little early nestlings are just kind of laying in their nest and hanging on, and then you have these big winds that come through that really rock the trees, that can be enough to displace these youngsters out of their nests. Another reason is just poor nest quality. We're going to talk about this a little bit later, but some species like great horned owls, they don't build their own nests. And they're not very picky either about which structures they lay their eggs in. And so that becomes problematic once those eggs hatch. Then there's something that's pretty natural, and that's predation, right? And there's a lot of different animals that can predate upon raptor nests, including other raptor species. But crows, raccoons, and some other mammals that are able to climb can certainly get in there, disturb the nest. And even if they don't injure the youngsters can certainly fall out. And then, of course, there's perhaps the biggest predator of all, and that's people. A lot of humans or human activity in the springtime revolves around tree work. So trees are cut down for development. Maybe there's some damaged trees or injured sick trees that need to be taken care of. And all of that type of work tends to be done in the spring. And the spring, of course, is nesting season for not just raptors, but a lot of other different wildlife. So many forms of both birds and mammals get displaced when this tree work is done. And then there's something that, for raptors anyway, is just considered normal post-fledging activities. And I'm going to describe that in a little bit. So today we're going to focus basically on two different life stages. And the first is the nestling. So a nestling is a stage of life from the time when the raptor hatches until the majority of its body, until the majority of the down rather on its body has been replaced with contour feathers. And so these are the feathers that will give shape to the bird. They will help the bird to fly. They will provide extra insulation to the bird. And you'll notice here from these photos that all these birds, not only are they downy, but they all kind of have the same posture, right? They're kind of sitting down on their legs. And the reason is because at this age, their joints are not very well developed. So they don't have the ability to use their legs or their wings like when they will be able to, like when they're adults. So the joints are very soft, they're very floppy, and as indicated here, they're not very well formed. So when nestlings are in this phase, where they're not very mobile, they can't defend themselves. They're very vulnerable, especially when they're on the ground. And what we find is most raptor species, they won't care for their early nestlings when they are on the ground. There's one exception to that, which we're going to be talking about, but for the most part, this is a general rule. And the other thing that people always ask us, well, won't the adults just, carry their youngsters back up to their nest? And the answer is no, they will not. In some cases, they can't. It's just because their chicks weigh so much. But a lot of times it's not something that they normally do. So that's when we tend to get involved. The Raptor Center really does a lot of re-nesting in the springtime. So we will work with professional tree climbers, with recreational climbers, and with a cohort of trained volunteers who won't necessarily climb trees, but they may climb a ladder and put a new nest about 10 to 12 feet off the ground. And sometimes that is sufficient to kind of solve the situation. Of course, this year we are really feeling the pain, so to speak, because we have suspended our volunteer program due to COVID-19. So our staff are being redirected for some of the other things that they're working on to really try to meet the need of young raptors. And we're going to see in a few slides how big of a need this really is. Now, most often we are able to reunite youngsters with their original families. So we just either will rebuild their original nest, or sometimes we can just put them in without any additional work on the nest. However, sometimes we can't necessarily reunite them with their own family. So what we can do though is cross-foster. And so fostering is basically when we take a youngster that we can't reunite with its original family and place it with another conspecific, so the same species, but another family that can handle another chick. And it's not just where you know of let's say a great horned owl nest and you have a chick and you can just pop it in there. There's a lot of considerations, obviously, in doing so. And probably one of the most important is that the ages are compatible. So as you can see from the photo, we cannot take the early nestling that you're seeing on the top and foster it with the family below. The youngster is way too young. It won't be able to compete for food, and it probably would not survive. And then on the flip side, if it was older than the adults in the foster nest, then it would outcompete the original chicks, and we wouldn't want to do that either. Our motto, whenever we're fostering, is do no harm. So because of that, we also would not add a chick if it's going to be greater than the normal clutch size. So for example, again, great horned owls, they can have a maximum of 3. If they already have 3, we would not add a 4th. That's just too much pressure and it's an unnatural situation. And sometimes we don't even know that until we climb a nest. We think we see 2 and we get up there and oh, now there's 3. So then we kind of abandon that effort and look for another site. Then there's the location of the nest site. Is it safe for our climbers to access it? And equally as important, do we have permission to be on site? Another thing that we may not know until we get up there is the health of any nestlings that are in the nest. If we climb and we see that one of them looks sick, we would not add another chick to that nest. Now, legally, we cannot remove that chick, the one that looks sick. We can't take any chicks from nests, but we can add them. And then also another really important consideration for our climbers perspective is the time of day. Many owl species get extremely aggressive in protecting their young at night. Not so much during the day, but at night. And you know, some days we'll have literally 3 great horned owls that we need to get up into nests all on the same day. And if we only have one climber available, sometimes it can take from the morning, you know, at one site, then we have to drive and set up and put the second one up, and then drive and set up and put the third one up. And sometimes it can get very close to dusk by the time we're doing that third one. And if that is the case, we will then kind of abort and do it first thing the next morning. It's just too risky. We have had climbers that have gotten hit in the head from an adult great horn, for example, when we're doing this later at night. Of course, no worries. They were, you know, wearing protective hard hats and stuff, but still, we don't want them to get hit. So the second age class that we handle pretty regularly is called a brancher. Now, a brancher is a raptor that is normally out of the nest. Its body now has all those contour feathers that we mentioned before. It has increased mobility, as you can see in these. It's able to perch and stand, but it cannot yet fly. It can only make short flights or glide. And these ones really create challenging situations. People will find them, see them attempt to fly, but because they can't yet fly, they think they're injured. So that's one thing. Another thing is that when youngsters are this age, the adults basically only drop food and go. They're not going to be spending time in sight with them at all anymore. And so another thing that the public usually figures is that, oh, they don't see the parents, these youngsters must be orphaned or abandoned. And so that's another thing we try to talk people through, is what to look for to see if there has been parental care. These guys can end up in all sorts of unusual places. You know, sometimes they're just on the ground, but sometimes, as the photo on the right shows, you know, they end up on the roofs on people's cars. In this case, this car is even in a garage, on people's rooftops, air conditioners, kind of in all sorts of unusual places. So what do we do with these guys? Well, most often, especially in this year, we will try to talk people through, first of all, assessing if the bird is injured and does need our help, or if not, if they would be able to place it up off the ground in a safer location. Now, sometimes they're being very brave and are helping, especially this year. We seem to have people being willing to put more effort in this year than other years. And then sometimes you'll get people who are just too afraid, which, you know, we can't blame them. And so that's when we will go out and, you know, we'll also make sure when we get out there that the youngster is healthy. Most often we will leave the youngster on site, and sometimes we'll just move it to a safer location. In the photo here, you can see one thing that we do is we try to get these branchers up as high as we possibly can without requiring a climber, because birds feel safer when they're higher, and even the youngsters do too. And so one thing we look for, though, is a branch that is at an angle so that that bird, that youngster, can actually kind of climb up the length of the branch to get higher. And it's something that is called laddering. So we try to give them opportunities to ladder. Now, for some reason, we're just not feeling good about the situation, like maybe there's absolutely no sign that the parents have been around, or maybe it's the bird is just not in a safe location and we can't figure out where it came from. We can also cross-foster these guys too. So what are some of the species we tend to see at the Raptor Center? Well, there are commonly 3 species of owls, 4 species of hawk, 2 species of falcon, and of course, bald eagles, of which we see more and more over the past few years. Occasionally, we'll see a couple of other species of owls, turkey vultures, which are very unique in that they normally have their little chicks in July and August, and they tend to nest in really kind of reclusive areas. And so we don't see too many of them. Osprey, of course, osprey have really made a comeback as far as nesting in the Twin Cities. We don't see too many of those either as nestlings. And then we had a very unusual visitor last year. And this is one of those situations why I never, ever say never. We got a common barn owl. Now, barn owls are not very common at all in Minnesota. And the other factor that went into this was that it was October. So our nesting season, as you can see a little bit from that timetable I included there for you, but our nesting season is usually 5 months long. It starts in March sometime, and it usually runs till the end of July. Well, getting a call about a baby in October, we're like, oh yeah, right. You know, it's probably another species that people often confuse with babies. And then they sent the picture, and we were just stunned. Not only was it a baby in October, but it was a baby barn owl. And as this turned out, it was the northernmost nest on record in the state of Minnesota over the past 50 years. So it was a big deal. Fortunately, that bird had food in its stomach, so we know that it had been fed by its parents, and so we were able to take it back and get it reunited. So I just next wanted to give you guys a little bit of a glimpse of what 2019 looked like and what we're kind of anticipating for this year as well. So I kind of broke down the species there with how many nestlings and branchers we assisted. Now this does not include all the birds that get injured or run into problems when they fledge. So when they fledge, they are fully flighted, and a lot of birds are very klutzy when they first start out. So a lot of times they'll run into things or be traumatized in other ways. So we have that whole caseload, but these here are just the nestlings and branchers that we actually go out and assist. So you can see in 2019, there was 139. And the 3 top were great horned owls, red-tailed hawks, which was kind of unusual for us. We normally don't see that many red tails, and bald eagles were a close third behind. Then to date, we've had 37, and you can see the majority of them have been great horned owls. Great horned owls are the most common large owl that we have in Minnesota. So last year we did a total of 25, and this year we are already up to 33. Now this also does not include all of the phone calls. You know, these numbers here just reflect the number of times we have actually gone out to a site and assisted a youngster. So in addition to that, you know, we have had a total of 65 different consultations with people. So that's almost, you know, 1 a day, which is pretty significant. And we are just getting started. So we have a long way to go, and certainly we're kind of finishing up the owl season. We're heading into hawk and eagle season, so we're gearing down. So how do we prepare? You know, we know what's coming, right? Traditionally, we have all this data. So how do we prepare for the nesting season? Well, there are a couple things that we do. First, we typically engage our volunteer corps, which of course we can't this year, but we provide them normally with training. We provide our interns with training, any new students that are going to be helping us with training. We also create an on-call schedule that is specifically to handle baby calls, because a lot of times people find youngsters outside of our normal business hours. And if we're not careful, they will just scoop them up and then bring them in the next day. So we try to kind of mitigate that by interacting with them in a more timely fashion to give them better options. And most often we're able to leave those birds on site. And then the third thing we do is that we get prepared and build nests. And every year we pretty much have a nest building party with our volunteers. So as you can see, we make 2 different types of nests. We make a group of stick nests, because most of the species we deal with that nest in a structure, nest in a stick nest. And then we also build some platforms. And this is just something we've started doing over the past few years, just because of the number of eagles, young eagles that we now have. So, you know, we're trying to be proactive. So when we get the call, we can just grab a nest and go out and do it. It does save a lot of time. So now I just want to do a quick poll here and ask a question. Steve is going to actually put out the poll for you, but have you guys ever seen a young raptor or an active raptor nest in the wild? I'm just kind of curious. Wow, it looks like the majority of you have. That is fabulous. Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that. It's something that, you know, is really exciting. And certainly once you learn what to look for, if you go, you know, walking, you know, in the woods or going on hikes or even just through your neighborhood, I'm sure you will find an active raptor nest. So that's exciting. Thank you for sharing that. There we go. I had to figure out how to get rid of that. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about each of the different types of raptors that we see as youngsters. And so we're going to start with owls. A lot of people love owls. Well, one of the issues with owls, and I alluded to this earlier, is that they do not make their own nests. And so that can be problematic, as we'll see in just a little bit. They tend to lay anywhere from 1 to 10 kind of white rounded eggs, depending on the species. And then there are ground nesting species, which we don't see as youngsters, thankfully, which would be snowy owls and short-eared owls, which tend to have larger clutch sizes. So most of the species that we see around here have anywhere from 1 to 5, but the ground nesters have anywhere from 1 to 10. And you can imagine why that would be. It's much more probable that they will be predated upon when they're nesting on the ground. So having an increased number of eggs just increases the probability that they will fledge some and they will be able to sustain their population. Okay, so when we get a raptor in, any raptor, there's always the question of when it's a fluffy, downy baby is, what is it? And so we've created some flowcharts, which we share with other people, with students and other rehabilitators that kind of help narrow down what the species is. For owls, it's relatively simple just because there aren't as many. But things we look for include the color of the eyes, the color of the beak, the overall face shape, the body size. Does it have feather tufts? Because not all species do. So the kind of typical eye colors we'll see will be pale yellow, bright yellow, or dark. The beak color will be yellow, again, dark or pale. The face shape would be super round or sometimes triangular, or in the case of the barn owl, kind of heart-shaped. And then we look at the body size and we kind of compare. So, a young bird that is downy still but can stand is probably going to be one of the smaller owl species, versus a downy bird which cannot stand is going to be one of the 2 larger species. So those are some of the ways that we can figure it out. So I've also created this chart, this comparison chart, which we again share with people to help them identify birds when they have them in hand. It's really nice to have these all on one page. So here I've listed the specific characteristics of each of the most common species, we're even including the barn owl now, that we tend to see in Minnesota. So we're going to take a look at some of these a little bit more closely next. All right, let's start with great horned owls. These are the ones that keep us the busiest in the spring. So as I mentioned before, adult great horned owls, they don't build their own nests. What they will do is they will choose rather an old hawk nest, crow nest, or squirrel nest from the year before. And these nests have really deteriorated over the winter. And so what happens is the owls don't even so much as add a twig to reinforce it. So the owls, when the adults lay the eggs and incubate, the nest usually is maintained. But once those eggs hatch and the youngsters start to move around, the twigs in that nest become more dislodged, and all of a sudden the nest will really start to fall apart. Add spring wind to that, and all of a sudden the whole nest structure will just come out of the tree. The good news, though, about these great horns is that they will raise babies on the ground. The problem is that people, when they find them on the ground, they're concerned. They don't feel like they will be safe on the ground. And so a lot of what we do with great horns anyway is really, we work to make both the people happy as well as make the birds safer. Now, as I mentioned already, great horned owls will very fiercely protect their youngsters at night, but not necessarily during the day. And so, of course, people are worried because you have cats and dogs and some other predators that may try to get those youngsters when the adults are not that actively protecting them. The other thing I do want to mention is that when great horned owls pick these nests, they pick a location that they like, not necessarily the nest structure. So that's probably why a lot of times they're picking nest structures that aren't adequate, but for some reason they really like where the nest is located. So young great horned owls, they have a very long brancher phase then, right? So many of them come out at a really early age, so they can be on the ground for anywhere from 4 to 5 weeks. They can't fly until they're about 9 to 10 weeks old. So they have all that time to kind of be inquisitive teenagers and investigate their surroundings. The other interesting thing about great horns is that they spend the longest amount of time with their parents. They're very kind of what we think of as slow learners. And if they get separated before that time, a lot of times they will not survive because they haven't learned all the skills that they need to, especially with procuring food. So our owls tend to start nesting in, well, they actually start establishing territories in January. And then a lot of their eggs will hatch in March or early April. And those chicks will spend all the way until October learning how to be great horns. So here are some cute photos I thought I would share, just showing, you know, a lot of different chicks that we've seen in different locations. Sometimes they're just on the ground. They're always of different ages. They have a real propensity for finding places during the day that they feel safe in. So these youngsters, once they can move, they do try to hide during the day. And of course, playgrounds, you know, offer some really good hiding places, like inside this tunnel, which is that photo in the middle, or on the bottom of a slide. So you can imagine the shock when a child goes out to play and this is what they find. So in this situation, you know, we will definitely go and move these youngsters to a safer spot. The one photo on the lower left that I am sharing with you, all those chicks, even though they're different ages, are from the same clutch or the same group of eggs. And so one thing here that I wanted to point out is that raptors will start incubating a day or so after they lay the first egg, and they only lay one egg every couple of days. Depending on the species, really depends how many days are in between each egg. But that means that the older chick could be as much as a week older than the youngest chick. And so that can create problems as well when you're trying to keep family units together. Another larger owl that we see is the barred owl. Now, barred owls are cavity nesters, and they really prefer natural tree cavities, more in dense woodlands. And these woodlands are usually near bodies of water, because part of the diet of barred owls will be some water organisms. So they will eat things like crayfish. They've been known to take people's koi, which are an expensive type of fish. They'll eat goldfish. I mean, they're pretty opportunistic with the water organisms that they will eat. They also eat rodents as well, but they're one that'll take other things as well. They leave the nest also pretty young, but not quite as bad as great horns. They'll leave the nest at 4 to 5 weeks, and they will basically be on the ground or branching for another couple of weeks. But here you can see they're very easy to identify, even as very young chicks. They're the only owl that we have in Minnesota that has a yellow beak and dark eyes. Now, when they come into our facility, if we have to have them for any length of time, we always like to try to house them in a natural environment. So the middle photo here shows you how creative we got one year, in that we knew we were going to have these barred owl chicks for at least a week, if not longer. And so we created this little cavity out of birch bark to make them feel more at home. And so it's very important, because one of the social bonds, or one of the bonds that is created with these youngsters when they're growing up, is they bond to their natal site. So it's really important that what they're looking at is where they will go to choose a nest site in the future. So that's kind of why we spent a great effort, if we do have to have them for any length of time, to make sure that what they're seeing is more natural. Now, barred owlets are one of the few species that will actually grab onto trees with their talons and their beaks, and they'll actually appear to climb. Now, can they climb all the way back up to the nest? No. But certainly if anyone ever calls and says, there is this fluffy owl that is clinging to a tree, more than likely it's going to be a barred owl. Another cavity nester that we see is the eastern screech owl. And these guys will very readily take to man-made nest boxes. And one of the fun things about screech owls is that they have 2 color phases. We tend to see in Minnesota gray phase more commonly, but there's also a beautiful rufous red phase. And what we found is that there can be adults of each color in the same, paired together, so in the same nest. So one adult could be gray and the other could be red. And then their young are either red or gray. As it turns out, gray is more of the dominant gene, for those of you who know genetics, and red is recessive. And as you can imagine, these little owls are tufted, and they're only about 6 inches tall. So you can imagine how the public will confuse them with baby great horned owls. Even adult screech owls, they'll think are baby great horned owls just because they're so small. So as you can see here, I did find a photo of a rufous color eastern screech owl youngster. We do get some, we just for sure get more grays than reds. And they can have up to 5 in a clutch. And as you can see, since they are so small, they can even get into smaller spaces. So sometimes people will find them perched, like this is on top of a wheel, under a wheel well, just always in a lot of different unusual places. It's always interesting every year to see where people are going to find these youngsters. Another small owl is the northern saw-whet owl. And although these are cavity nesters, they really prefer to nest in woodpecker holes. Now, what's interesting is this species usually only, used to only nest usually in northern Minnesota, but about 10 years ago, nests started being reported in the Twin Cities area. And there is some thought that maybe they are competing with eastern screech owls for some cavities, because you just don't find as many screech owls nesting in the cities anymore. Now, another thing that's really interesting, I think, about screech owl or saw-whet owls here is that their juveniles, their youngsters, are a different color than they are. And then over the summer, they will molt into more of the adult plumage. So I want to show you what they look like because they're really beautiful. So they have a dark brown head and back, a buff colored chest, brilliant yellow eyes, and very pronounced white eyebrows. And if you can compare that in the photo on the bottom there with the adults, you can see how different they look. The only other species that is similar to this is the boreal owl. Their young also have the same color plumage, but we don't see boreal owls youngsters at all. So then we know if we get one, it's definitely a saw-whet. Now I just want to talk a little bit about hawks. We spent this whole time so far talking about owls, and we have the whole hawk season to look forward to. So hawks do build their own nests, and some species will actually reuse them year after year. Now hawks tend to lay anywhere from 1 to 5 eggs, and their eggs are mostly white, but they do have some buff color and a little bit of flecking and splotches, so they're a little bit more exciting, let's say, than owl eggs are. So, however, hawks can be a little bit more challenging to identify when they're young. So again, here are some of the features we look for. We look at eye color, the color of their cere, which is that fleshy colored area right above the beak, right here. We look at the color of their down. Some youngsters have white down, some have off-white, and some have gray. Then we also can look at some specific foot characteristics. So the photo that I shared with you on the lower right shows what we call an accessory pad. There's a little projection on the underside of some of the toes in certain species. And they have these little projections right from the time they hatch from the egg. So when we're not sure about what a species is, we can really help to limit the possibilities by finding out if they have these little projections on their feet. Also, different species will vary in their leg length. And then also, they have some different vocalizations too, which I'm going to share in a minute. So here again is another sheet that kind of identification sheet that describes all of them on the same page with different photographs and their different characteristics. And it really helps to have these. We use these as references in the clinic a lot. As I said, I've shared these with other rehabilitators. And we find it's obviously very important to know what you have. Because that'll help you to figure out what habitat you're looking for, what nest type, what behaviors to expect, to figure out if the bird is healthy behaviorally. And so all these things are really important. So let's take a look at a few of these. So red-tailed hawks are the most common large hawk that we have in Minnesota. They can be found everywhere. They've really adapted pretty well to suburbia. And they do, as I said, construct stick nests, and they're you know, they're not all that choosy as far as the type of tree. Most of the time they aren't deciduous trees, but they will nest in evergreens as well. And the neat thing about them is that they will use their nest year after year if a great horned owl does not take it over. So there have been spots in Minnesota where in small tree lots, a red-tailed hawk will build a nest. Red-tailed hawks build nests, starting somewhere at the end of March in Minnesota. Then the following year, the great horns, which start nesting, remember I said at the end of January in Minnesota, they will see that hawk nest and move right in. So then when it's time for the hawk to build a nest, they look and they say, okay, now a great horn has moved in. So they will then build a new nest on the other end of that same woodlot. And then this cycle keeps happening. Then the following year, the great horns will pick that newer nest, forcing the red tails to rebuild their first original nest. So it's a real interesting dynamic. So red-shouldered hawks we're starting to see more and more of. They inhabit moist woodlands, so very similar habitat to barred owls. Now they will build a stick nest as well, but they basically will build this nest on top of an existing squirrel or crow nest. So they don't necessarily start the nest, they'll use the bowl that's already there and just add to it. And one unique thing about red-shouldered nests is that they will add some type of vegetation to it. And we don't really know why. Maybe there is some thoughts that maybe it's for parasite control, but it's pretty easy to identify red-shouldered hawk nests because of the vegetation. Normally it's in the form of evergreens. So as I mentioned, one way that you can identify some of these hawks is by their sound. They're very vocal. And red shoulders have a very distinct sound. And it takes this bird a little while. It's fine to get guys like these. There. There, now it's getting it. It's so interesting to hear them try. But they do this a lot in hand, so it's pretty easy to identify them. Broadwing hawks can very easily be confused with red-shouldered hawks when they're young. And these birds inhabit, again, some wet woodlands, but they've also moved into urban and suburban areas. The problem with that is they are extremely aggressive during the mating season. And so from the time when they pretty much are ready to lay their eggs all the way until about 2 weeks past when their youngsters fledge, they can be very aggressive. So we get a lot of calls in June and July from people that are essentially being quote unquote attacked by these birds. So we do a lot of education, we're trying to tell people what they can do and to be patient and that, it will come to an end. So as I mentioned, these birds, are very difficult to identify compared to red shoulders, but they also have a much different sound. So I'm going to just play the sound for you and compare it to what the red shoulder sound was like. It's coming. So theirs is basically not a squeak, but it's just a high-pitched squeak. They will do this in the end as well. So the last hawk that we commonly get frequently nowadays is the Cooper's hawk. When I first started 30 years ago, the clinic rarely saw these birds. They were very unique. They were more deep woods species. And, if we got 3 or 4 of them a year, it was pretty exciting. Now the clinic sees over 100 every year, and probably, about 20 to 30 of those are juveniles. So they've adapted very well to urban and suburban life. And one of the things that raptors look for when they're deciding on a nesting territory is the abundance of prey. Well, certainly people have helped Cooper's hawks out a lot, being bird eaters, by having bird feeders. So they just, people are just providing these birds a smorgasbord of easy food. And so that's one of the reasons why Cooper's hawks are now extremely prevalent nesters in cities. They just take advantage of the birds at bird feeders, which you can imagine also creates conflict. And we try to talk with people about, what they can do to help minimize this, and just how to live with nature. Everyone's our neighbor, and we all have to learn to live together. So now I just want to touch bases really quickly on falcons. There are 3 species of falcons that we typically see, and each one has a different type of nest. One will nest on a cliff face or on a building ledge. Another is a cavity nester, and then there's one that's actually a stick nester as well. However, whatever nest they choose, they do not build themselves. Now, typically falcons can lay between 1 and 5 eggs, and their eggs are absolutely beautiful. They have varying amounts of dark red color, and they're flecking and splotching. So they're just really beautiful, beautiful eggs. So these are the 3 Minnesota falcon youngsters that we typically will see, kestrels, merlins, and peregrines. You can see that, again, we have similar features that we use to identify them: the color of the beak, the color of the cere, the color of the down. In this case, we also add the color of the feet. And what you'll see as we go on, we're not really going to talk too much about peregrine falcons because we really don't see that many as nestlings or branchers. But when we do see them a lot is as fledglings. So when they fledge, especially those birds that are nesting in the city, there are a lot of obstacles that they can run into, all these other buildings. And I don't know if any of you have ever had the opportunity to watch a bird of any species fledge, but they're very awkward. Their first flights are not smooth and graceful at all because they have never used their wings before. So when you have a bird that's nesting in the cities with all these large obstacles around them, it's not too surprising that they tend to collide with buildings. But the other 2 tend not to have quite so much trauma when they first fledge. The first one is the American kestrel. Now, kestrels are the smallest falcon that we have in Minnesota. And they also are similar in that they like more edges of woods. They're similar to red tails in that they like edges of woods, but they also like to have open areas for hunting. So you'll find them traditionally in farmlands, on edges of cities, places like that. They are cavity nesters, and they will readily take to man-made nest boxes. Now, over the past, at least decade, there's been a real concern that the population of kestrels in the United States is on the decline. And we certainly have seen that also with our numbers. Again, when I first started, we would get 50, literally 50, young kestrels that we would have to try to either return with their parents or we'd raise them and put them through a slow release process. Now, if we get 5 or 6, that's pretty amazing. And there's a lot of theories as to why that decline is happening, but nobody knows for sure. So the populations are being monitored. There's a lot of citizen science projects monitoring these populations as well. So one of the things that we need to do if we do have these youngsters when they're this age, is if we need to get them eating on their own as soon as possible. The one thing we don't want to have happen is that for them to associate us with food, and that association can happen very quickly, like within a day. So one thing, as I said, we try to do is we try to encourage them to eat on their own. And this is about a 7-day-old kestrel. And so what you see is, even though he can't see real well here, we have gotten him to self-feed off of a lid. You can see he's still a little wobbly. He can, barely stand. He will undoubtedly lay down after he's finished with his meal. You can just see sometimes he reaches for things and he doesn't quite get them because he can't see that well, like right there. Yep. So that's one of the important things we need to do if we have to have them at any point in time. A species a little bit larger than the kestrel is merlins, are merlins. So merlins traditionally have been in the northern part of the state, inhabiting more dense woodlands, but they also, like saw-whet owls, have moved into our area over the past 10 to 15 years. They really love to nest in jack pines, and in certain older parts of our cities, these pines are prevalent. So they've kind of moved in, and as you can see, from this photo, they have a very, very large amount of down. So if you have a young kestrel in hand and a young merlin, one of the ways that you can tell the difference is just by the thickness of the down. Their down is also gray compared to a kestrel's, which is more white. Again, this is another species that is very, very vocal. Kind of ear piercing at times. And the youngsters will do this basically from the time they hatch, if they feel like they're in distress. Okay, well, a talk on baby raptors wouldn't be complete without talking about bald eagles. So, you know, bald eagles build the largest stick nest of any raptor that we have in the United States. Basically, they start out when they're first building to be 4 to 5 feet long and 2 to 4 feet deep. And that's just to start. They will add onto a nest every single year to make it larger and larger. They tend to nest near bodies of water, and they lay kind of either 2 to 3 smooth, white, kind of subelliptical eggs that are almost the size of a tennis ball. And they will typically lay these in February or March. And their young will stay in the nest for about 12 weeks. So there's a very long nesting phase for these guys. And when they come out, they don't branch at all. They are ones that take off, and their first flights are usually long glides until they can reach another tree. So we're going to do another poll here. What do you think is the first thing you would do if you found a young raptor? All right, very good. Well, most of you did what we tell people to do, is to take a photo and either call us if they're in our service area or call their local rehabilitator. The only time when we would suggest they actually grab it is if that bird is in an unsafe location, if it's in the middle of the road or something where it's in imminent danger. But otherwise, we strongly suggest that they do like you guys would do, and you know, take a photo and call someone who can give you some advice. Very good. So next, I just wanted to spend the next couple of minutes just sharing some stories from this year with you. So this first one was a great horned owl nest that I personally handle. It was in Shoreview, Minnesota, which won't mean much to some of you, but the nest was in a very thin trunked tree, an evergreen tree. And the chicks, both of them had fallen down. There was not much left of the nest structure at all. And so my husband, who is one of the climbers that we sometimes utilize, and I went out because now we are already in social distancing phase, so it was safe for us to be together. We went out and we did not have one of our pre-made nests handy, so we actually had to build a nest on site, which we did. These people had an old Christmas tree that had been discarded, so we were able to take a lot of the branches and evergreen boughs from that tree and make a nest. And the nest tree, as you can see in the photo there, is relatively thin. The actual nest was higher than that, but it wasn't really going to be safe to put it that high. So what we did, since all the chicks were on the ground, is my husband just kind of put it up. There's about, I don't know, 10 feet or so below the original nest. And one of the things we always do with the public is we ask them to monitor, because we feel responsible. We know that 99% of the time what we do is going to work, but there's always that 1% chance. So if there's someone that's able to monitor it, we definitely go for that. And so this is the photo that they sent the next day, or a video rather that they sent the next day. They can see this from their house window. So as you can see here, the adult is feeding the youngsters in the nest. That is always so gratifying to get feedback like this. And I've heard since that these birds have successfully branched anyway. They're not yet to fledging age, but at least they branched. So sometimes you never know what the situation is going to be. Here's another unique one that another staff person handled, where the nest for the great horned owl was almost to the very top of one of these very, very tall evergreen trees. The good news was that the person who found it, her husband worked for the fire department. And so they were able to bring out the fire truck with their long ladder, and our staff person climbed up the ladder and was in the kind of boom compartment of the ladder and was able to successfully put that chick back. Now, the good news is that she also had one of our pre-made nests, because when you're up that high, you don't want to have to do a lot of moving around, especially if you're not a climber who has all the safety equipment. So this is one of our pre-made nests, and you can see how comfortable the chick looked there. And we also got this nice photo of feedback, again, the next day, that the adult was tending to the chick in that new nest. So a couple of weeks ago, we got another interesting great horned owl question. You can see here that the road was a little wet. It was just after a rainstorm, and people wanted to know, if this bird was all right. Well, this is an adult owl that's wet and it's hunkered down. So, to me, no, it may be injured. So we asked them to approach it. When they did, this is what they found. This was an adult female who was protecting her youngster and keeping it dry during the storm. So again, we went out and built a nest and put it up in that tree and gave her a helping hand. So one final great horned owl story I want to share is the young great horned owl that you see on the left was a bird that was found down in Mankato. Now, normally, if we had our volunteer corps working with us, we would have been able to have a volunteer make a new nest, but that was not able to happen. So we talked the homeowner through doing it, and he made an okay structure, probably would have worked. But the mistake he made is that he kept feeding this bird, even though we told him not to. The bond between a youngster and an adult is all through food. When youngsters are hungry, they make a food begging call, and that's where how the adult will find them, especially when they're out of the nest. The other issue is that this had been going on for like 4 or 5 days, and he had fed a very poor diet. So we got the baby in. He was able to bring it to us. We were very concerned about its bone health, so we put it on a good diet for about 5 or 6 days. And then we were lucky enough to get another call about a bird of a similar age in Hennepin County at the Adult Corrections Facility that was out of the nest. And so we went and we put the two together in a new nest. And that one has worked well also. So that just kind of is an example of the fostering. We now have gotten our first baby barred owlet of 2020. It was about a 10 to 14 day old owl. And as you can see, there's our climber out there who's doing a little investigation of the bird. Everything was healthy. And so he did go ahead and put the bird back up. And as you can see, the adult was watching the whole entire time. Oops. So then we just had a couple other faces from this year. A northern saw-whet owl, which, as I said, is not one of our most common owls at all. And what was really interesting about this one is how old it was. It was way older than when we typically see them at this time of year. This bird had already fledged, and it was found in the middle of the road, presumably hit by a car, but only got glazed. It was a little bit depressed, but didn't have any injuries. So we just kept it for a couple of days. And then there's Gail, one of our staff people, who, with her mask on, practicing social distancing, went and returned it to the area. It was in really good body condition. And the other owl species we have seen is an eastern screech owl. This one came from Minneapolis. There were 5 of them all on a branch. Well, 4 of them were on the branch, and this one was on the ground. Now, we don't really know what happened, but this one was very thin. So for some reason, it wasn't getting enough nutrition. So we still have this one in the clinic. And what we're going to have to do is kind of do our best to prepare him to release him. So we're going to have to give him live food and things like that. So I thought that was kind of fun. So that's really a summary of what baby season is like, at least the first part. And we certainly know we're going to have a busy one going forward, especially having to redirect some of our staff without our volunteers. So now Ellen Orndorff, our development officer, would like to share a few words with you.
everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in for our first ever webinar for supporters of TRC. I hope you enjoyed it. One of the things I really love about my job is I'm always learning something new. So thanks, Lori, for putting this on for us. So I want to share with you that the Raptor Center is facing an unprecedented $200,000 shortfall due to COVID-19. We can cover $40,000 of this from cost savings and reserves. To resolve the remaining shortfall, we need to raise $160,000 from our community before June 30th. Fortunately, two generous donors have put forth an $80,000 match for these needed emergency funds. Gifts towards our baby shower campaign count toward the fund match. In other words, your gift to the baby shower fund helps the Raptor Center in two ways. It helps provide for young raptors that need our care, and then it also helps provide financial stability for the Raptor Center. We'll get through this pandemic stronger and more resourceful than ever, thanks to you and other supporters. Later this afternoon, we will be sending you a recording of the webinar and a link to our giving page. If you're able, please help us with this $80,000 match. Thanks so much for all you do for the Raptor Center. Have a great weekend.
Okay, so with that, do you guys have any questions? I know I threw out a lot of information at you and didn't allow you to have or ask any questions throughout. So does anyone have any questions now? Okay, so I guess I can read them, which is great. So where do you learn to make substitute nests? We basically have a instruction sheet on how to make a basic stick nest. So, you know, now when we're asking other people to do this, we have a form that we can email them that kind of gives them the basic structural design. Because there are a few things that are really important, like you want to make sure it's the right size, has enough drainage, things like that. And then do we have Northern Minnesota volunteers? Not a lot of them. We do have a few scattered throughout, but we are always looking for volunteers in certain pockets of Minnesota and certainly way up in the northern areas. That's one where we're weak. Of course, right now we're not using volunteers for much of anything, but hopefully that'll change as our restrictions lighten up a little here. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much, everyone, for spending this hour with us. I certainly get so excited about sharing baby stuff. And so I really appreciate your time. Thanks and have a great week or so, and we hope to see you soon.